What if I were to tell you that the King James Bible is full of flaws? Not just one or two, but many of them. That's coming up next, right here on The Parker J. Cole Show. Hi, and welcome to The Parker J. Cole Show. I'm your host, the Queen, Parker J. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking to my returning guest co-host and contributor today, Doug Woodward. He is the author of the book we're going to highlight today called Rebooting the Bible, the astonishing story of a 1900-year-old rabbinical conspiracy to corrupt the Bible's ancient history and thwart belief in Jesus as the Messiah. There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to this series too, because this book is simply part one of a 3-book series, Rebooting the Bible. But today we're going to focus on many things. And one of those things we're going to focus on is flaws versus inerrancy, manuscripts versus agendas, and conspiracy versus conservation. It's all going to make sense in just a few moments. As always, I want to thank you for your support. We have been showcasing Christian authors worldwide for 10 years. As God gives us grace, we'll continue to do so. To find out how you can help out, simply go to patreon.com/rightstuff. As always, we covet your prayers. To stay up to date with PJC Media, simply go to pjcmedia.net. Click that pink follow button. You'll never miss a show. Without further ado, I'm going to bring Doug on board. Doug, how you doing?
Hey, Parker J. Cole. It's good to be with you. Thanks again for the invitation.
And thank you so much. I was really excited to talk to you about this book. We were supposed to talk about it back in 2019. And, and dear listener, it was so funny because he's been on the show since then. But dear listener, when I was cleaning up my house probably for the first time in years, I found this book and it was still in the packaging. And I said, oh my gosh, this is Doug's book he sent to me. And when I looked at the postage date, I was just so embarrassed. I said,
well, better late than never, right?
Really, and particularly for a time such as this where the Bible is coming under attack, people are losing faith, or people are gaining faith for that matter. It kind of goes in flux. There's a lot going on, and we want to be good at our discipleship. Now, before the broadcast, I talked about the KJV, which is King James Version of the Bible. I talked about being full of flaws, and some of you may have already hung up on me as soon as I said that, but we're going to qualify our position here. And so I can't wait to dig into that in a moment. But Doug, go ahead and let people know what makes you so good about this topic.
Well, it's an area that I've studied pretty intensely now for about 5 or 6 years. And I've written, a lot of text about well over 1,000 pages related to it. And it's been a really good, strong seller in terms of catching the attention of folks and so forth. But I guess, it was, I had focused on prophecy and in a book on Mars and some other things, for quite a long time. But I got very interested in this subject when I ran across a gentleman named Barry Setterfield, who was an astrophysicist, but he also had written extensively on the manuscript known as the Septuagint, which briefly was a Bible, a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek almost 300 years before Jesus was born. And so Barry had talked about the Septuagint, talked about the chronology, talked about the different things in it that really were conflicting with what's known as the Masoretic text, which is the text upon which the King James Bible is based primarily. And so when I came across that, it just opened my eyes to a lot of issues that I thought, wow, this really requires some study. And goodness, if I think about all my colleagues that write about Bible prophecy and things like that, they really don't know about any of this. And so, let alone the folks that read their books. So I thought, this is an area that I really need to drill down on and really focus on, because it's an area that just isn't talked about. And when you dig into it, you understand why it is so important, because of the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, which actually leads back to this issue of why there are flaws in the King James Version, at least especially the Old Testament. And so anyway, that's kind of why I dug into it, and I guess that's why uh, you know, I have some association with the topic.
I know for myself, my listeners are going to say, but Parker, you say all the time that you love the King James Version of the Bible. And I do, and I always will. And I particularly memorize scripture in KJV because I just love the lyrical prose of it. Let not your heart be troubled sounds so much better than the messages, don't worry. so um, it's a stylistic thing, but I have never been a KJV onlyer. I always have been open to more better translations of the scriptures. I thank the Lord for that. But for some people who are KJV onlyers, this may be a major blow to your worldview. Rest assured, we're not saying pick up your KJV Bible and throw it into the trash. We're just saying that you need to make some considerations about KJV, its flaws, but you also want to know about its strengths. And at the end of the day, we still want to talk about its inerrancy. So there's a lot going on here. We're just going to dig right into it. So, in your introduction, you spent quite a bit of time telling people why this is important. So, what are just three of the major points that the KJV Bible, which was based off the Masoretic text, is important for us to understand that there are flaws?
Well, I think it boils down primarily to the issue of, what is the testimony regarding Jesus and whether or not he is the fulfillment of the prophecies related to being the Messiah. And so and a lot of things flow from that. But if we recognize, for instance, that there are arguments against the validity of Christianity because of certain things that are based on the translation of the King James Version, the way that certain prophecies are stated, or the way that the chronology is stated in the King James Bible, and whether or not there really is any sort of historical backing for that. These are issues that have to be thought through. Um, and so, anyway, that's a big factor. So I think it gets down to the defense of the Bible, and the defense specifically of the best argument for why Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah and what makes him the Messiah. And so, anyway, so I think those are probably the important things. At the end of the day, we don't really want to just defend a version of the Bible. We want to defend the truthfulness of the Christian faith, and I think that's the thing we have to center ourselves on.
And this becomes a topic of inerrancy. So let's give a definition of what inerrancy is.
Well, of course, inerrancy means without errors, and there's of course always been a lot of debate about whether the Bible makes errors or makes mistakes. The traditional, conventional, evangelical position, the conservative position, is that the Bible is inerrant, without errors, in the original autographs. That means in the compositions themselves. When David wrote the Psalms, or when Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which he was, I believe, the essential editor or essential writer of that. Once you go into that, you have to realize that the Bible is without flaw. All right, so it's at that level. It's at the level of the autographs, the compositions, and of course the compositions are written a long time ago. Moses would have written, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, about 2,000. Let's see, almost 3,500 years ago, and so that's a long time. And of course, the Bible goes through a lot of transitions and translations since that time. And so we try to look back and try to find the most authentic, the most, the best uh, text manuscript support that we can find. And this is where the Septuagint begins to come into play. And again, the Septuagint was it was a translation of the Hebrew Bible in around 280 BC, and it was actually taking the compilation of the Old Testament that the priest and leader Ezra created around 420 BC. And so it's not that long from his original compilation of all of the prophets and the histories and the Pentateuch and so forth. It's only about 140 years from that time until the Greek was written. And so the chances are very good that what Ezra compiled, in fact, is captured meticulously in the Greek translation. And as we get into what happened to the Hebrew Bible 400 years later, it becomes important to see why the Greek translation really is vital if we're going to get an accurate picture of what was originally written.
So you were talking about the Septuagint. You correlated with the Old Testament. So I really want people to understand exactly what we're talking about, because there's a lot of terms here. And in Rebooting the Bible, you go into it deeply. If you can give us the cliff notes, the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which would have been the Old Testament, from 350 BC.
About 300 years before Jesus. 280 BC is when the first five books, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, those books, and then also afterwards the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the book of Ruth. Those books were probably all translated very much around the same time, around 280 to 250 BC. Now, over the next 120 years, the other books were translated, and it was about by 130, 135 BC that the complete Septuagint had been translated, and some of it actually was written for the first time in Greek, First and Second Maccabees, which we might be familiar with as part of the Apocrypha. That was in that time frame, but by 100 and let's say 150 years before Jesus began to teach, the Greek translation was complete. And it turns out that 80% or more, perhaps as much as 90% of the quotations of the New Testament, when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it is quoting the Greek translation, the Septuagint, and not the Hebrew. And so that's the story and the importance of the Septuagint. The other issue, though, is what happened to the Hebrew text. The Hebrew text, which is known primarily as the Masoretic text, that was in process of being changed. It was gathered together by formerly the Pharisees that became the rabbis around 100 to 120 AD, roughly 400 years after the Septuagint had been translated. The Hebrew Bible was assembled by them, but it was changed. Many of the verses were changed, specifically those verses pertaining to who the Messiah was, what was his mission or goal, and how would he bring salvation to the people of God. And those were specifically the verses that were changed, and those then lead to what we're talking about when we say the errors in the King James Old Testament. And another quick point of perspective: if we understand that the Greek version was what was being quoted by the apostles and the writers of the New Testament, if we understand that they were quoting the Septuagint, it's important, because then we see that those things that are in the New Testament, those quotations, they differ from the Hebrew in the Old Testament that they were quoting from, because the Hebrew had shifted. It had been changed by the rabbis. And so consequently, the Old Testament in the King James and the New Testament in the King James don't agree with each other. And that people may have noticed that when sometimes they read quotes and they go back from the New Testament, look at the Old Testament quotation, and they say, wait a second, there's a difference there. That's not what it says. Well, the reason that there's a difference is because it was altered by the rabbis, the Pharisees, in the first and second century A.D. And that's the real crux of this whole story. Not just the Messianic prophecies, but also, importantly, the chronology that's talked about in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. The chronology that really is put there so that we understand the pathway from Adam all the way to Christ, and why Christ was the promised Redeemer and his lineage, his genetics basically flowed from the trail from Adam through Abraham through Mary into the bloodline, the DNA of Jesus himself.
What's fascinating about this topic, it leads to my second point about this book, Manuscripts and Agenda. And so you went through a very concise summary of what readers will expect when they pick up their copy of Rebooting the Bible. But you also let us know that there is an agenda with making changes to the text and making changes to the Bible. This becomes important because it shows my third point about conspiracy versus conservation. And conspiracy means that there are factions at work conspiring together to bring about a certain agenda. But conservation is that no matter the conspiracy, the actual message of the Bible still remains that Jesus is the Son of God, that he did die to save us from our sins, that he is the Messiah, that he is God. One thing you say in the introduction is that you're not trying to say throw out your King James version of the Bible. You're not saying that, but you're saying too that the Holy Spirit works to conserve his word.
The Christian faith is based essentially on the Bible. Now, the Catholics would say it's based also on tradition, and they're not entirely wrong about that. But the Protestant view is that the Word of God comes to us through the Bible, through the Scriptures. All right, and so if we see that as the basis of our faith, then its preservation, it's for us the ability to identify what was actually said originally by the authors, that becomes critical to what specifically we believe. And it's not secondary, it's primary. And so we have to understand that. And then the conspiracy issue, it's important to recognize that the context of all this is that the the Jews were, of course, they were under assault, and by assault, they were basically their temple had been destroyed. Let me turn off this thing here. All right, sorry about that. I don't know why that was doing it, but anyway, all right, going back. The Jews were under assault because the Romans had destroyed their temple, and with that, they had destroyed the fundamental basis of their religion because it was based upon the temple ritual sacrifice, and so forth. But the temple was gone, and so around 100 to 120 A.D., the former Pharisees that had dubbed themselves now rabbis or sages, they determined that they had to recreate the Jewish religion. It could no longer be based upon ritual because there was no temple for them to do so. And so they created what we could call the oral law, the Mishnah, and they wrote it down. And they said that the Mishnah, the oral law, I won't try to get too deep here, but it's that it was actually also given to Moses, and it flowed through Ezra and so forth. But it opened up a different revelation. The revelation for them was the oral law, and it superseded the written law. Most folks aren't familiar with the fact that the Jewishness or the Jewish religion that we all know today is rabbinical Judaism, and it is different from the Judaism of the Old Testament. And so the conspiracy is that the Jews were seeing that the Christian evangelists in the first century were converting huge numbers of Jews to the Christian faith. Their temple had been destroyed, their religion was being destroyed, their land was being destroyed, and so they had to do something to try to preserve their culture, and importantly to them, their religion. And so what they decided to do was alter key verses in the Old Testament, and this is the conspiracy, and to change the core issues that the Christian evangelists were preaching, that Jesus was divine, that he came from God, that he was God. They had to change his mission. His mission in the Septuagint, it's clear that he is coming to bring the Gentiles into the people of God. The people of God are no longer just the Jews, but they are potentially all people. That Jesus' mission is to do that. And then thirdly, the Jews would emphasize the law as the means of salvation. But in the Septuagint, we read verses that tell us that salvation comes through the name of Jesus, trusting in that name. It's not the following the law, but it's rather believing in Jesus and in the grace and the salvation that he provides that gives us salvation. And so these are radical differences from the Judaism that was created again in this sort of first and second century after the temple had been destroyed in 70 AD.
One thing about the conspiracy versus conservation aspect of this discussion is that we show that there's the injection of the supernatural, meaning that the Holy Spirit is working to conserve his message despite the machinations of men. And so I think that's an important part of the conversation. The other part is the identity and faith. Right now, in current society, we see our faith and identity as separate, that they don't correlate. But for these Jews from back in the day, they were very much a part of their identity. I'm Jewish because of my beliefs. My beliefs are not separate from my identity. This is why you have so much confusion right now in the church. But I can understand why they would do certain things because their faith was just as ingrained into who they were as people. And I think that's something we need to take into account too.
Right, right. And they felt threatened, and they were under assault, and felt like that their religion was going to be overthrown as well. And so they had to strike at the heart of the position of the Christians and try to push back on that. And that is essentially what they did in the way that they reworded a number of the scriptures. Not many, but probably less than 100, 150 verses in the Old Testament. Again, messianic passages, and then the two chronologies of Genesis 5, which was from Adam to Abraham, and then, from Adam to Moses and to Noah and his son, and then the second part, chapter 11 of Genesis, really takes us then from Shem all the way down to Abraham. And so these things were changed, and we may or may not have time to go into it, but essentially 1,500 years was cut out of the chronology of the Old Testament. And when that happens, all of a sudden it makes the Bible's chronology and history different than what science and what archaeology and so forth has shown us regarding the age of the Egyptian empire, the age of the Mesopotamian civilization, and so forth. If we go back to the chronology of the Septuagint, which was one of the things that was changed, all of a sudden the Bible begins to line up with the academics today in terms of what they teach about the timing of the Egyptian civilization, the Mesopotamian civilization, and so forth. So it becomes a real key factor in helping us to understand that our Bible doesn't conflict with what archaeology is showing. And that's something that, again, we get if we understand the Septuagint, but we don't get if we rely solely upon the Masoretic text and specifically then the King James Bible.
One thing you mentioned as you were talking about this, I want to make sure that our listeners know there is no anti-Semitic thought in this book at all. You're just
Right.
really just stating the facts as you've researched them. We're not going to go through the whole book. We're going to go through what's really important to our conversation, go into the creation of the Alexandria Septuagint. This is just a quick history lesson that I think everyone will benefit them from.
Alexandria is a city that is incredibly important to Christianity for a variety of reasons. But one of the ones, of course, is the fact that the Septuagint was created. Now, Alexander the Great and his general Ptolemy, which starts off with a P, by the way. It's not Ptolemy, but it's Ptolemy. He became the pharaoh. Ptolemy became the pharaoh, and he was named Soter, Soter, and then he was Ptolemy the first. Ptolemy the second was known as Philadelphus. That was his son. Ptolemy the first basically he wanted a copy of the Hebrew law, and he wanted that for the library at Alexandria. Library in Alexandria was an amazing institution. I could go into great depth about it, but all I'll say is that all of the ancient wisdom of the ancient world was stored there. And there were books of laws from different civilizations, but the Hebrew law, which was the Pentateuch, was not there yet. And also in Alexandria, there was about a third of the population were Jewish for various reasons over the past 3 or 4 centuries before this point in time. Many Jews had settled in Alexandria, Egypt. And so Alexander, in his conquering of Egypt, was around 328. So we're talking only about 4 decades later after the city was founded that the Septuagint was commanded to be translated from the Hebrew into Greek, and it was facilitated by the request of the Pharaoh, Ptolemy I, to the priests in Jerusalem to send experts. Now, there's a long story that's talked about in the letter of Aristeas that goes into detail that probably is somewhat legendary or mythical. But nevertheless, the truth is very obvious that there were experts that knew Hebrew and they also knew Greek, and they were able to create a translation that held up extremely well in terms of the accuracy and rendering what was the way that the Jewish language would say certain things. But perhaps more importantly for us are the facts that they created in terms of the language of the prophecy specifically, and then the dates and so forth that are provided in the chronologies. And so anyway, that's where and why the Septuagint was created. Starting to be created around 280 BC, and then was finished about 135 BC. All right, and again, that became all of the books of the Old Testament plus the Apocrypha, and those existed by that point in time.
The Library at Alexandria is one of the seven wonders of the world. We don't have it today because it was
Well, it
destroyed.
was destroyed actually in the Civil War with between Julius Caesar and one of his rivals, Pompey, and it was burned probably around 45 BC. And so Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, we have them to blame, probably for the fire that destroyed the library in Alexandria for the most part. So, an interesting bit of history there.
It would be wonderful to see what it looked like back then. And those things are lost to the annals of time. But the Lord does say that our knowledge will fade away, but his word will stand forever. I think that's of significance to mention that. In the second chapter of Rebooting the Bible, we go into the Jewish wars. And these wars are significant to the biblical translation because this is
Mm.
about what's going on with the Septuagint. So the chapter is called Rabbi Akiba, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, and the Septuagint attack begins. So go ahead and tell us what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, there's a bit of history that most folks, even folks that know about the war in the first century that led to the destruction of the temple, most folks don't know that there really were three Jewish wars, and that the Jews were actually the arch enemy of the Romans for the better part of 100 years, I could say. Really, beginning early in the middle of the first century and leading up to the destruction of the temple. And then there was another war known as the Kitos War, which was around 119 A.D. And this was a war that was fought predominantly outside of Judaism, outside of Judea, but involved Jewish settlements around the Mediterranean. And it was a particularly vicious war. Then the third war is known as the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, which occurred around 135 to 138 AD. And there's a lot to talk about there, but essentially, the Rabbi Akiva was the leader that helped to, I guess you could say, facilitate or bring about the new Hebrew Bible, it's known technically by as Proto-Masoretic, but the Masoretic text was really launched at that time, and it's the text that we've been talking about that becomes the basis for all the Protestant Bibles as well as the Catholic Bible, not the Orthodox Bible, because the Orthodox, such as the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, all of that, that's based on the Septuagint because they've never gone away from the Septuagint as their Bible. But the Masoretic text at that time, Rabbi Akiba believed that Simon Bar Kokhba was the Messiah because he was a mighty warrior and he was defeating the Romans in many battles. And so he fit the profile that the Jewish leaders believed the Messiah would be, which was someone who would conquer the Gentiles and establish the Jews as physically as the rulers of the world. And so this was defeated, of course, in that time frame. Both Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiba were shipped off to Rome, where ultimately they were basically killed, by the Romans as punishment for inciting this tremendously vicious war. And it's at that point where Jerusalem essentially is destroyed and becomes Eliana Capitolina, and becomes no longer it's no longer Judea. It becomes known as Palestina or Palestine, which really was a reference to the Jewish enemy, the Philistines, and so it was meant to be a grand insult to the Jewish culture and the Jewish people.
Fascinatingly enough, the Christians will also become a thorn in the Roman Empire side
Mm.
because they just would not bow to Nero. They were in the center of a Caesar cult, as one person said, and Caesar was God, and they said no, he is not. And they will also become a thorn in the side of the Romans, but through that they spread the gospel throughout the world. And so I just wanted to add that in there because you talk about all this history. All
Yeah,
this history is the stuff that's not in the Bible, because a lot of stuff you have to look outside of it to just understand what's going on during this time period, because it also helps increase our understanding of various texts in the Bible, just so we have a better clarification of various things. So there's a lot going on here, and
it, it
there's
became.
mhm.
I was going to say it became very difficult to be a Christian and live in Jerusalem because of the Jewish leaders who were persecuting the Christians, as well as the Romans who ultimately would destroy the Jewish people and the Jewish culture. And of course, Jesus had predicted that, and that's why so many Christians fled Jerusalem around 66, 67 AD, just shortly before the Romans actually attacked Jerusalem. Jesus had said, when you see the armies encircling Jerusalem, you need to basically flee and don't stop to pick up your coat. You need to go. And they did. And many fled. But again, all of this was a way of pushing the Christians to go around the world to begin to preach the gospel and to, again, the goal here is bring the Gentiles into the people of God. The people of God are no longer just the Jews, but they are also now those Gentiles who believe in the name of Jesus.
One thing is that you have to understand the hotbed of culture clashing here and belief systems and faith. So, just like we have this hot culture wars today, it was the same, just different ideologies are at play here. And if you want to really understand the context, imagine just all this craziness going on where people are on one side of this, one side of that, just clashing, pulsing together. It's a hotbed of a lot of conflict here. And Jesus walks right in to all this conflict. And he doesn't do it during the peacetime, he does it during one of the most conflict prone areas of our history here. And so you mentioned about how the whole point was to bring the Gentiles to the Lord. And this goes to the next part of our discussion that we're take some time to go through, because you spent a lot of time saying that there were flaws in the KJV version of the Bible. But now, as you say here, introducing hard evidence. This is chapter 4. Tampering with the text, comparing the Septuagint with the Masoretic text. You say here, our study makes some severe allegations sure to spur disagreement, consternation, and condemnation from many quarters of Christendom and Judaism. Are these allegations provable? Is the evidence plain enough to justify the claims that rabbinical schools at the end of the first century intentionally corrupted what became of the Masoretic text? Should such corruption cause concern that our Bibles have been severely altered? Do these variances introduced in the Old Testament really matter? This author, Doug, claims the evidence is unassailable and it does make a difference. So now the time has come to introduce the hard evidence backing up this claim. It's also time for the Protestant Christians to reclaim the Septuagint as our preeminent historical text. Our Bibles must take the Septuagint into account with deference to many, if not most, of its readings. And so now we're going to go through a few of these texts here, and you're going to highlight the difference. So, what I would like for you to do before we go into which texts have been altered, I want you to explain the methodology that you use to illustrate this.
Okay. Well, let's see. In terms of methodology, essentially what I did was I said, well, let's look at the way that the Bible is translated today in one of the more popular and well thought of versions, which is the English Standard, the ESV. Let's look at that as presenting the current English understanding of the New Testament, right? And specifically the quotations in the New Testament of the Old Testament, right? Then the second thing we look at is the Septuagint, the English translation of the Septuagint. And here I used Breton's translation into English of the Greek Old Testament from 1851. Now, there are many more now, newer translations that have been done since 2007. And the recent one I would recommend is around 2019. But nevertheless, that's the second thing, is let's look at what did the Septuagint say. And then thirdly, what did the King James Version say in these same verses? And how does the wording differ there? And does it support the Septuagint? Does it support what the New Testament says, or is there a difference? All right. And so I look at 24 different verses, and probably a dozen of them are really strong, and probably the other dozen aren't quite as strong, but still carry out sort of the same point. And so, so we can look at a number of verses and point that out if you'd like.
So what I want to do, I'm going to choose some that I felt like, and I won't lie. Someone's like, not that big of a deal for me, right? And I know some of my other readers, when you pick up your copy, you may have the same response, because you're like, the content isn't that big of a deal. And there's just some places where I kind of, even, and Doug knows I'll tell him this. So I'm like, yeah, it's just like, okay. But the ones that really matter really do have to do with the Messiah. And those are much more glaringly apparent. And I think those are worth looking into as well. So you can look at this and compare it yourself. So we're going to look at a couple of these verses here. So we're going to highlight the differences between Matthew 13:15 with Isaiah 6:10. Now, these are verses that echo each other from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So we're going to read it in the ESV. I'll read it in the ESV, and I'll read it in the KJV version, and then we'll go with the Septuagint. Okay, so that's how I'll do it. And then, Doug, you can kind of say, why is this a big deal?
Okay.
So we'll do that.
Or why it's not as big a deal as some of the others that we'll talk about.
Right. Or just your commentary like you have here. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at Matthew 13:15. In the ESV, it says, "For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them." Now it's going to go back to KJV and Isaiah, which is paralleling this verse here, make the heart of this people fat, and make their eyes heavy, and shut their eyes, let they let they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and convert and be healed. Now, the Septuagint says this: For the heart of this people has become gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and be converted, and I shall hear them. Now, if you look really closely at this chart, the Septuagint and the ESV are more closely aligned with each other than the KJV. So go ahead and expand on why this passage is important to this topic about altered text.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think there are passages, and this would be an example where the emphasis of the words that are used, perhaps in this section, in this verse, the insult towards the Jews and their lack of understanding is probably more pronounced in the Septuagint than it is in the Masoretic text, meaning that the Masoretic text, those that were putting it together did not want to be seen as so dull of hearing. Yeah, they didn't hear well, but uh, in the Septuagint, it's more clearly spelled out that they, just as Jesus was saying that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they missed it. They should have heard, they should have understood that it was the time of their visitation, but they didn't. Their ears were very dull. They were blind, and so the Septuagint in this example is a bit stronger in the way that it's worded towards the leaders of the Jewish people, and especially at the time that the Messiah comes.
The next one we're going to look at is Hebrews 10:5 and comparing it with Psalms 46. And Hebrews 10:5 in the ESV says, Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he says, Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body have you prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. In the KJV, it says, KJV, Psalms 40 and 6, sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. And then the Septuagint says, sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body thou hast prepared me. Whole burnt offering and sacrifice for sin thou did not return. Now, this one is more glaringly apparent that there is something vitally different between the KJV version and the ESV version. And this is one of those passages that is the most obvious deviation from the original text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this verse basically points out that the Messiah is speaking here in all the words of Psalm 40, verse 6. And of course, David, when he writes these Psalms, and so many times he is actually creating prophecies of, that would become, in effect, prophecies of the Messiah. We think about Psalm 22 and all the details about the crucifixion and how that was prefigured in that psalm. Here, it's talking specifically about the fact that sacrifice and offering really aren't what is going to cause God to be, to forgive us. And it's not what God necessarily really desired. Instead, he's prepared, the Messiah says, that a body has been prepared for me, meaning that his body would become the focus of the sacrifice. And instead of a body that thou hast prepared me in the Septuagint, the Masoretic text says, mine ears hast thou opened. And it's radically different. It's not the same. And this is a prime example of the fact that the folks that were in effect compiling and sort of remanufacturing the Hebrew Old Testament, they were editing it pretty strongly. They didn't believe that the Messiah would be God, that he would be coming in the flesh, and that it would be his body that would become the focus of the religion. That was the sacrifice, rather than animal sacrifices on the altar. as the Jewish religion had been all since the time of Moses.
And one of the last one I will highlight on, because there's so many in here, and I want to encourage you to pick up your copy of Rebooting the Bible, is from the comparison of Matthew 1:23 with Isaiah 7:14. And I actually found this one a great interest. The ESV says in Matthew 1:23, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. In the Masoretic text, and it's not in the KJV, interestingly enough, it says, "Therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, the young woman shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." And you make a note here, we are not using KJV here, but the Jewish Tanakh, 1917 for the Masoretic text. And the Septuagint says in Isaiah 7:14, "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive in the womb and shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Emmanuel." Now, this is very vital here because this talks about the sinlessness of Christ here. So now this is attacking his birth by changing the text from virgin to the young woman. Go ahead and expand on this for us.
Right. Yeah, it's likely that the King James folks that were doing the translation recognized how severe a difference this would be if they were to go with what the Jewish version in the Masoretic text was saying, which was young woman, rather than a virgin shall conceive, because the virgin birth was critical to the Christian doctrine of the fact that Jesus was God coming in the flesh, and that he came through a virgin, and therefore was not basically entangled with the sin nature that all humankind is entangled with, and so he was sinless from his very birth, and maintained that sinlessness throughout his life. But it's interesting that if we look at even roughly, let's say, 80 years after the destruction of the temple, um, the one of the key apologists for the Christian faith, Justin Martyr, he wrote in his book Dialogue with Trypho, who was a Jew. It was probably somewhat fictional, but yet somewhat based upon interactions that he had had with Jewish people. He gets into this specifically and talks about why would the prophet talk about a young woman? Why would that be special? Because all births come about through a young woman. So if the prophet was saying something, he had to be saying, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive," because that was unique, that was miraculous, and there was nothing miraculous about a young woman conceiving. That would not be a sign from the Lord. And why would you call his name Emmanuel? And so it's sort of contradictory in that verse itself to conceive of any other wording other than "a virgin shall conceive." So there's a lot to this, a lot of discussion, and the differences in the Greek words and the Hebrew words and so forth. But that's the essence of this one.
And there's a lot more where that came from. So, dear listener, I encourage you to pick up your copy of Rebooting the Bible, the astonishing story of a 1900-year-old rabbinical conspiracy to corrupt the Bible's ancient history and thwart belief in Jesus as the Messiah. Go ahead, pick up your copy today. You won't be disappointed. There are 3 books in this series. You can get them all online by simply going to faith-happens.com. Again, faith-happens.com. And that's Doug's website where he has his research, blogs, interviews, and more, especially links to his books that you can buy online. So, Doug, I want to thank you so much for being with me on the show today. I really enjoyed having you.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's a difficult subject, and it is kind of hard to do in an interview because the amount of information is it's mountainous. And going through all of this, it's kind of, once you go through it all, as most people have told me, they're just sort of blown away. They'd never heard about this before in any of their church going, and it becomes, as I've said, that's the argument. It becomes vital to understanding how our faith and our Bible can be defended. Is we have to understand that the original wording goes back to what was translated into the Septuagint. That's the closest wording to what was originally intended and inspired in the authors.
Doug, thank you once again for being with me on the show. Can't wait to have you
You're
back and
welcome.
have you back real soon.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thank you again for inviting me. It's always a good time when we get together and talk.
And we were talking today to Doug Woodward. He is the author of the book Rebooting the Bible, the astonishing story of a 1900-year rabbinical conspiracy to corrupt the Bible's ancient history and thwart belief in Jesus as the Messiah. Were you titillated by some of the things that we said today? I encourage you to get your copy. You are going to learn so much when you delve into the word of the Lord. And at the end of the day, the Lord still conserves his word. So it doesn't matter the flaws. It doesn't matter the agenda. It doesn't matter the conspiracy. What does matter is that the Holy Spirit works in the affairs of men to keep the context and content of his message the same, that Jesus Christ came to heal a sin sick world. And you can find that all out today. Go ahead, pick up your copy of Rebooting the Bible, available wherever books are sold. Thank you so much for joining me for this edition of the Parker J. Cole Show. You have a wonderful, absolutely glorious, blessed day, and God bless.